In this video, we're going over the concepts for chapter 11, which is titled Carbohydrates. Let's first understand how carbohydrates look in terms of their structure, and we're going to discuss some of their functions. By definition, a carbohydrate is going to be a molecule that contains multiple hydroxy groups. And additionally, you may find an aldehyde or a ketone. To give you an example of a carbohydrate, on the right side of the slide, we have ribose. In looking at the structure for the molecule of ribose, we can see the multiple hydroxy groups. And additionally, this carbohydrate has an aldehyde. Carbohydrates are also known as sugars, and they taste sweet. There are many functions for carbohydrates in living systems. They provide energy through oxidation. They supply carbon for the synthesis of cell components. They serve as a stored form of chemical energy, and they form part of the structural elements of some cells and tissues. We actually experience carbohydrates through food. And you can see in figure 11.1 some examples of food products that have carbohydrates. They include pasta, bread, and rice. Based on their composition, we can say that carbohydrates can be categorized into monosaccharides. And a monosaccharide is going to be the simplest form of a carbohydrate because there is actually one unit of sugar in monosaccharide. That's why it has the prefix mono to signify the single unit of sugar in these compounds. Monosaccharides, the majority of them have between 3 to 6 carbons, but understand that also carbohydrates can have 7 carbon atoms or even 8 carbon atoms. So typically, to give the complete range, monosaccharides can have anywhere between 3 to 8 carbons in length. Some examples of monosaccharides include glucose, fructose, and galactose. Later in this chapter, we're going to learn some facts about those monosaccharides. Next, we have the disaccharides. Disaccharides specifically are formed by the combination of two monosaccharides. That's why we see the prefix di before the word saccharide. And before I move on, saccharide is another word for sugar. And we just learned that carbohydrates means sugar. So just keep that in mind. Continuing on. When it comes to disaccharides, we see an example of a disaccharide. And here we have the example of sucrose. Sucrose is what we know in everyday life as table sugar. And the two monosaccharides that are unified or linked together covalently to make sucrose are glucose and fructose. Lastly, we are also going to study polysaccharides. And polysaccharides is going to be a single carbohydrate molecule that unifies many units of monosaccharides. So we know that these structures form a polymer, which a polymer is going to be a long chain of these single units, monosaccharides. And to give you an example of a polysaccharide, in the right side of the slide, we have the structure of starch. Starch, it is a polysaccharide that is actually made of glucose molecules. One of the things about carbohydrates is that carbohydrates are going to have different groups on the carbon atoms in their structure. And specifically, because of the different groups that you have around the carbon atoms, we must discuss the topic of stereochemistry. Stereochemistry is the branch of chemistry concerned with the three-dimensional arrangement of atoms and molecules. Many of the carbons, except the one that is present in the aldehyde or the ketone, meaning the carbonyl, are going to be tetrahedral. And since there are many carbons in carbohydrates that are tetrahedral, we can actually use different symbolisms to show actually the 3D structure of those tetrahedral carbons that are present in carbohydrates. So if you have a tetrahedral carbon, and we see the images in the bottom of the slide for figure 11.4, we can observe that if a carbon atom has four different substituents, we are going to specifically illustrate the positioning of those substituents by using wedges or dashes. The wedges are basically indicating that the bond is coming out of the plane, or in other words, off the page. So you can imagine that if we were looking at a tetrahedral carbon, then in this example that we have in figure 11.4, the bromine is the one that is actually facing you. So it's extending out of the plane. Dash is on the other hand, and let me use my highlighter tool so you see the difference between wedges and dashes. So the wedge bond is going to be this one. And the dash bond is going to be this one. The dash bond is actually going to indicate a bond that is in the back of the plane. So it's facing away from you. And whenever we're trying to draw on paper the 3D arrangement for tetrahedral carbons, then understand that those wedges and dashes can be utilized in order to represent some of the groups that are present. We are going to see some of these illustrations a little bit later throughout the presentation, but just understand that because some of the carbon atoms present in carbohydrates are going to have four different groups, we can utilize specifically this type of drawing to represent the arrangement of the atoms around those tetrahedral carbons. Now, it is important to note that whenever a carbon atom has four distinct groups, that is known as a chiral carbon. And by definition, a chiral carbon is going to have a specific description that basically defines it at a carbon that if you have its mirror image, that mirror image is not going to be able to be superimposed. When it comes to chirality in objects, in everyday life, you may have encountered chiral objects. So, for example, our hands are chiral objects. So, if you place your hands one in front of the other, then you see that they mirror each other. The different fingers are going to be facing each other, and basically the left hand to the right hand, you see that these are mirror images. Other objects that are considered chiral because it has this type of arrangement include gloves and shoes, okay? Certain organic molecules are chiral, meaning that they have their mirror image, and that mirror image is not superimposable. Superimposable basically means that if you pick one and you put it over the other, they are not going to fully line up. So for now, let's understand the different chiral carbons that may exist in a molecule. So you can see in this practice problems that if we have compounds, we can actually find what are the chiral carbons that are present in it. So I'm going to do all three problems, and I'm going to first zoom in on the first one. Okay. As I just mentioned, a chiral carbon by definition needs to be a carbon atom that has four distinct groups. So when it comes to this, the best way to do this is start by labeling the carbon atoms that you have in the molecule. You may highlight them or you can simply put a letter on them. So I'm just going to say, well, this is carbon A, this is carbon B, this is carbon C, just to give them a specific notation. You can pick A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, whatever you want, or you can highlight them. Next thing, I need to ask myself, does the carbon atom has four different groups? If we look closely, specifically at carbon A, it has three hydrogens and is connected to carbon B. So since carbon A has three hydrogens, carbon A is not a chiral carbon. By the same definition, carbon C, since it is a CH3, that is cannot be a chiral carbon because it has three of the same. And in order for something to be chiral, it needs to have four different groups. That leaves us to understand what is happening with carbon B. In carbon B, when we see what is exactly attached to it, we see that it is attached to hydrogen, to NOH, and then on either side, it has CH3s. Since we have the same cluster of atoms on the left of the molecule and on the right of the molecule, that means that carbon B is not chiral. So overall, this molecule is not chiral. The term is actually the way that you say it is to say that that molecule is achiral, and there is not chiral centers in it because there's no chiral carbons. Okay, let's now do the example for letter B. I'm going to start by labeling the carbon atoms. This is going to be carbon A, carbon B, carbon C, and carbon D. We learned in the previous example that if you have a carbon atom that has three hydrogens, that carbon cannot be chiral. So that means that specifically carbon A is not chiral. Carbon D is not chiral. Then let's look at specifically B and C. And I'm going to start with the carbon that I labeled with the letter C. The carbon with the letter C actually has two hydrogens. And by definition, in order for the carbon to be chiral, it needs four different groups. So since carbon C has two hydrogens, carbon C is also not a chiral carbon. So from now on, understand that a carbon with three hydrogens or a carbon with two hydrogens cannot be considered a chiral carbon. Let's now investigate what are the groups connected to letter B. So I'm going to use my highlighter tool to actually highlight the groups. So in carbon B, I have a hydrogen. I have a CH3 group. I have an OH group. And that CH group is also attached to a CH2CH3. That means that carbon B has four different groups or cluster of atoms. So that means that carbon B is chiral. Typically, whenever we are trying to designate a notation for a chiral carbon, what we do is that we write an asterisk. So I'm just going to put an asterisk specifically at carbon B to know that that carbon is chiral. And since my molecule has one chiral carbon, then the molecule overall is chiral. Let's look at our last example. As I've done before, I'm going to label the carbons. This is carbon A, carbon B, carbon C, and carbon D. As we learned from the previous two examples, when it comes to the chiral carbons, carbon A cannot be chiral because it's a CH3. Carbon D cannot be chiral because it is also a CH3. Carbon C is not chiral because it's a CH2. And lastly, we need to investigate what are the groups connected to carbon B. Carbon B, and I'm going to use the highlighter for this. Carbon B is connected to oxygen. It's also connected to CH2CH3, and it is also connected to a CH3 group. Carbon B is trigonoplanar. It's not tetrahedral. And because it does not have four groups, then that means that carbon B is also not chiral. By definition, in chirality, the carbon needs to have four groups that are different, not three. So that means that overall, this molecule does not have a chiral center. So the molecule is not chiral. So we don't have to draw an asterisk at any of the carbons in molecule C.